take a minute for the YouTube to load. But people should start trickling in soon.
Great.
Record. Am I blind? Maybe. Oops. Hold on. All right, so it is being recorded and it is live streamed. So everyone who is on, hello and welcome. This is Bonnie Hamilton, University of Toronto.
And she's going to be talking about microplastics in Arctic ecosystems. All right. And then you guys can use the Q&A for questions. All right.
All right. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Hopefully. All right. So my name is Bonnie Hamilton, and I am a researcher at the University of Toronto. And today we are going to talk about the Arctic and the threats that it faces. First, I want to thank the organizers of the National Biodiversity Teach-In. I've had the great honor and pleasure of doing this a couple years in a row, and it's truly my favorite thing to do. Thank you to them for continuing to host this event. I think it's an excellent platform for science communication and education, and I'm really excited to be here today. All righty. So in honor of International Day for Women and Girls in Science, I thought I would do a quick intro of who I am and how I got here. So when I was a kid, I loved being outdoors. I was an absolute water bug, needing to be bribed to get out of or off of the water. I was one of those kids that collected bugs in peanut butter jars and would recite facts about beluga whales at the dinner table. Bless my parents for their patience. But when I went on to university, I knew I wanted to study science, and particularly environmental science. So I took a track focused on environmental toxicology, and this began my journey in understanding anthropogenic stressors like chemicals and plastics and how they impact our ecosystems. So my work in undergrad led me to do fieldwork in all kinds of places, including sort of Central and Upper Michigan, as well as the United Kingdom. And I was able to ask questions that were really interesting to me and lead a senior thesis as my last year in my undergrad. And so then I ended up taking a bit of time off. And I worked in Michigan fisheries before becoming a short-term contractor for the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, which is where I studied plastics in the deep sea. And that springboarded me to where I am today. And this is how sort of my non-linear journey, I guess, as a kid and through my academic career. And now I have the opportunity to work in the Arctic, which has always been a dream of mine, and study contaminants with northern partners across the Canadian North. All right, so what is considered the Arctic? When you think about the Arctic, what do you think of? Feel free to type some answers in the chat. But the Arctic is the northern part of the globe. So if we can visualize a globe in front of us and sort of looking down, this is the North Pole. And then this light green color is the Arctic Circle. And then this darker green color is the low Arctic. And then this lighter green color is the subarctic. So you can kind of divide it into three different categories. This light or this yellow greenish color is known as the Arctic Circle, which is 66.5 degrees north. And as you can imagine, the Arctic is almost entirely covered by water, and it holds 20% of the Earth's supply of fresh water. So it's a really important component of our global ecosystem. Not only is it cold, and like some of us have put in the chat, and filled with snow, it's also extremely diverse. So there's more than 21,000 highly cold adapted species in the Arctic, and this includes everything from mammals, fish, seabirds, little invertebrates, and they provide invaluable ecosystem services for those who live in the north. But the species in the north are at risk from anthropogenic or man-made impacts. And some of those man-made impacts are things like warming temperatures, sea ice loss, habitat loss. It's no secret that the Arctic is facing unprecedented environmental change as a result of climate change, and it's experiencing an increase in temperature 2 to 3 times the rate than the rest of the globe, which results in things like sea ice loss, which then ultimately leads to things like migratory changes among animals like polar bears. So this is from the IPCC 5th Climate Assessment Report, and in reality, I should have put the most recent one in here. So my apologies for that, but what we can see here is sort of on this top panel is a change in average surface temperature. And so if we move across this bar, the darker colors is the warmer it is, right? And so if we focus on the Arctic, we can see that there's a really dark red at the top, and the same thing goes for precipitation. So dark blue equals more precipitation. And so the Arctic bottom line, really, and the big takeaway is that the Arctic is going to get warmer and wetter. And that can be significant when we start to think about not only habitat loss and how it impacts the critters that occupy the North, but also how it affects contaminants like chemicals and plastics. So I mentioned very briefly that the warming is causing a loss in sea ice coverage. And sea ice is not only a winter highway for many Arctic animals, but it also helps control our climate. So sea ice traps contaminants. So they're considered a reservoir for things like chemicals, pesticides, plastics, and things like that. So when the ice is melting, so if we look at this figure here, 1985, which is far before most of you were born, we have a lot of ice, right? The more white it is, the older the ice is, which is good. We like old ice, right? But then if we sort of fast forward to March 2018, which wasn't that long ago, we can see that decline in really old ice. And so it's more seasonal new ice that maybe freezes and thaws with the seasons. And so this old ice can harbor things like chemicals and plastics. And as they continue to melt, what's being trapped in that ice can be put back into the environment and reintroduced to the system. Okay, so we kind of did a very, very quick crash course on what the Arctic is experiencing when it comes to a warming climate. And I mentioned that there's a bit of interest in trying to understand what that means from a chemical, plastic, other contaminant point of view. So the Arctic is also under stress from contaminant exposure. And this includes anything and everything from your legacy chemicals, so things like what we call persistent organic pollutants, otherwise known as POPs. And POPs are things like PCBs. If you live in the Great Lakes region, you might be familiar with PCBs. Those are a type of chemical that are now banned, but we can find them in pretty high concentrations in the fish that we find out of the Great Lakes, which is why there's eating advisories, consumption advisories for how much Great Lakes fish you should eat. This also includes things like forever chemicals like PFAS. So I'm from Michigan, so this is a bit biased, but PFAS has been in the news a lot lately in terms of understanding and finding it in groundwater sources. And then this also includes things like plastic pollution and plastic additives, which are chemicals added to plastics when they're made to give it some of these characteristics that we really enjoy as consumers, like its flexibility and its durability. All right, so when we think about chemical contaminants in the Arctic, these legacy chemicals, these POPs that I kind of mentioned, are things that are persistent, pervasive, they bioaccumulate, meaning that they move up the food chain and get higher as they go up the food chain, which is known as biomagnification. So these are just fancy words that mean chemicals can move throughout the ecosystem by being eaten by one another. And then they're also independently toxic. And so these chemicals, like our PCBs that we find in the Great Lakes and other sort of persistent chemicals, are monitored in the Arctic and have been for several decades. And they're also regulated so that we decrease the amount that have been produced over the last several decades, which then, of course, leads to a decrease in seeing those trends in the environment. And you're probably wondering, why am I telling you this and what this has to do with plastics? But plastic additives are sort of this newer concern of chemicals for us environmental scientists. And some of the questions we're wondering is, do these additives that are in the plastics, are they able to move into the environment? Do they meet these above criteria? Are they persistent? Do they bioaccumulate? Are they toxic to animals? And there's not a lot of data on this. So this is sort of a newer component that scientists are focusing on, and we have a lot to learn, which we'll dive into in a little bit. So the Arctic is really far away from all of us, right? Lots of you, if you have access to the chat, feel free to put in where you're calling in from. I'm in Toronto. I know that the hosts of this are in Illinois. And so the Arctic is obviously not close, right? But the global sort of ocean system and atmosphere system is all connected. So plastics and chemicals can get to the Arctic from places like the Great Lakes or Southeast Asia or Europe through hitching a ride on air currents and ocean currents. And then once they get into the Arctic, they can move throughout those ecosystems, like bioaccumulation, like we talked about, and also just movement through regional currents. So it's not just legacy chemicals and these other chemicals that exist in the Arctic, but plastic pollution is sort of the new component in the club, right? And so when we talk about fate and transport, the Arctic, we like to say it's a sink. So usually what happens to chemicals when they end up in the Arctic, when they go to the Arctic, they usually don't come out and they get stuck. And the variety of pathways that lead plastics and other chemicals to the north. So like I said a few minutes ago, right, they hitch a ride on currents, like ocean currents and atmospheric currents. And this can include by falling into the Arctic through snow deposition or rain or wind. When it's in the ocean currents, it can be transported on the surface. It can be moved throughout the water column. It can settle out. It can be picked up by ice when ice is formed. And then ultimately, too, when they end up either to the Arctic or within the Arctic, plastics can be moved by chemicals. So they can be, moved by animals. Chemicals can too. And what we mean by that is for a seabird, for example, if a seabird eats a piece of plastic and in the south, let's say on the coast of Maine, eats some plastic, flies up to the Arctic for its summer breeding habitat season, and then it poops out plastic in the north, right? So then it's becoming a biovector, and movement of contaminants from the south to the north through animals. And then obviously we can also put plastics and other chemicals in the Arctic by human transport, right? Litter and things like that. Okay, so when we talk about plastic pollution, we are referring to a variety of different types. There are large pieces of plastic we find in aquatic and terrestrial systems, like these big water bottles, single-use plastic bags, straws, fishing nets, otherwise known as ghost gear, that sink their way to the bottom of our lakes and oceans. And these larger items are referred to as macroplastics. But microplastics are a little bit of a different story, and they come from a variety of sources. And one thing I like to go through is called the breakup. So you have these larger pieces of plastics, and they can break up over time, whether it be from environmental weathering, UV degradation, bacteria accumulating on the surface, and eventually these larger pieces can then fragment into smaller pieces, otherwise known as microplastics. And so there are, as I said, there's a variety of different sources of microplastics, things like fragments that can be shed from boats or fishing equipment. Fibers are fleece jackets that we love to wear in the winter, shed lots of microfibers. Our laundry machines shed microfibers. Nurdles, which are pre-production manufactured pellets that are melted down to conform the consumer goods that we use. And these can often be accidentally spilled into the environment. And then microbeads, which are these small spherical beads that are often found in personal care products. They end up in wastewater treatment plants. Sometimes they don't get captured in wastewater treatment plants because they're not equipped to deal with this type of thing. And then they get put out into the effluent, into our rivers and streams. So these are just an example of sort of where all of those types of plastics can come from, right? We've got residential sources, they can come from an industry, they can come from agriculture, they can come from roads. And ultimately, microplastics are incredibly diverse. So we just went through a couple of the different shapes, otherwise known as morphologies, but they also are quite complex. They can range in color, they can range in size, the different types of things, right? Where we have our primary production products that are like personal care products and those nurdles. But then we have all of these secondary types, like shedding from our fleece jackets. And then if we think about the chemical side of this coin, plastics have chemicals, right? Polymers, there's different types of plastics. If you flip over a plastic container at your house, it'll tell you if it has PP on it, it'll be polypropylene, and those indicators tell you what type of plastic it is and how it can be recycled, right? And then there's the types of chemicals, those additives that I mentioned earlier that are added to the production process that then can be leached into the environment. So seabirds, as I said, are sort of they're widely studied, and they're a little bit of the poster child of plastic pollution in the Arctic. But they've also been identified in things like beluga whales, which are my favorite animal, and fish and bivalves like mussels. And so this is a concern when animals are ingesting plastics. And this is just an example of how that can affect an organism. So this is a water flea. And this water flea, on the left-hand side, you can see its gastrointestinal tract, it's the gut, right? And this gut is black, which tells us it's normal and happy and healthy. But after being exposed to plastics, that gut is white, which tells us that those plastics are being lodged into its gut, which is probably quite uncomfortable for the water flea. And so this is just an example of when animals, big or small, ingest plastics, that there are some effects. And if we think about this idea, if we go back a couple slides in our heads and put on our thinking caps about how plastics are complex, they're complicated, especially when it comes to plastic additives. I just kind of want to unpack that a little bit because it's getting a lot of attention. And I think it's an important part of plastic pollution. And I think it bears worth discussing quickly. So plastics have those chemicals ingredients, right? So if we think about chemical ingredients as being these triangles, these blue and purple triangles, and then the pink circles are plastics, right? They can be on the plastics, part of the plastics. Some of these chemicals are in the environment. And so these plastics can transport these chemicals to different environments and within environments. And then wildlife can interact with these plastics and their chemicals. And when they're ingested, a fish, for example, could poop out that plastic, but then that fish could also harbor some of those chemicals. Those chemicals can stay in their tissues, which could cause some effects. And so if we move this back to the Arctic, plastics have been identified in a lot of different things, lots of different animals. So this is a variety of different animals and environmental compartments that we have in the Arctic. The circles are plastic particles, and then the squares are plastic additives. So we've found plastic and their chemicals in a variety of different animals like seabirds and whales. And we've also found plastic and plastic additives in the air, in wastewater effluent, and then we've found plastic just by themselves in things like fish, invertebrates, walruses, and a variety of different abiotic environmental compartments like rivers, ice, and ocean currents. Alrighty. So we just did a very quick crash course on 3 very big topics of interest in the Arctic, right? We did a little bit of discussion about increasing temperature and climate change and how that can change the contaminant landscape and how that affects ecosystems and animals in the Arctic. And then we talked a little bit about plastic pollution. Plastic pollution has lots of different effects: entanglement. It can be stuck in their stomachs of fish that are digesting them. It can cause additive chemical toxicity from those chemicals that are in the plastics, and then chemical contaminants, right? So some of those contaminants and chemicals, that are in the plastics can cause things like messing up your endocrine system, your reproductive function, and your metabolism, things like that. So when it comes to my own work and what all this means, is the Arctic and the critters, creatures, and people alike are living in an accelerated version of what's to come when it comes to climate change. And it's super important to understand what these 3 things, climate change, plastic pollution, and chemical contaminants, mean in terms of effects alone and in combination in Arctic ecosystems. And so we have these 3 stressors, what that means for a variety of different important organisms to the Arctic. And ultimately, we can use that information to understand individual effects and then effects at higher levels of biological organization, meaning we can look at effects from an organism level, a population level, a community level, and then eventually an ecosystem level to really understand the effects over time. But then ultimately, what does that mean for local communities, right? Because the Arctic, while it is far away, is home to 4 million people. And these indigenous communities live, their livelihood is tied to the land and tied to the fish and tied to the bears. And so it's really important to understand the impact this could have on local communities, which is where my work focuses quite heavily with Northern partners. So the majority of my work is done alongside community partners in Qeqtarjuaq and Iqaluit, which are in the Central Arctic and the Eastern Arctic. This is Hudson Bay. So if we were to go just further south here, you would see Lake Superior, which maybe would help orient you. So we're just directly north as far as you can go from northern Michigan and Minnesota, basically. And so my work focuses on these 3 stressors that we talked about and how they affect wildlife, both alone and in combination. Currently, the majority of my work focuses on Arctic char and lake trout in Iqaluit, otherwise known as Cambridge Bay, which is a vital food source and economic source for the community. And then on the eastern side of the Arctic, I work with communities looking at the transport of plastics into the Arctic through that biovector component through seabirds, and how seabirds are maybe bringing plastics to the north, potentially by pooping them out, which is fun and smelly. And so I'm really fortunate to have been welcomed into both of these communities and work alongside our partners to achieve a shared goal and to co-create these projects that answer these questions that not only are interesting from a scientific perspective, but are extremely important and a priority for the community to understand, what impacts their food sources. And so ultimately this work is driven by my local partners. And these are the types of questions we strive to understand as a team. So how do plastics enter and move through the Arctic? What are the effects of these plastics, climate change, and chemicals on Arctic species like Arctic char? And then, as I said earlier, what does this mean for overall ecological health, but also their traditional country food like fish, bears, things like this. And everyone has a seat at the table, and we work collectively to weave together our knowledge and better to understand this. And so let's see my little schematic here. But all stakeholders have a seat at that table and are provided the space to consult on research priorities and ways forward together, which is I find to be a really privileged seat that I have in order to learn from my northern partners, and I'm really fortunate to have community relationships that are so keen to try and understand these larger issues. So in the end, if we go back to this figure, the end goal is to really understand what the impacts are to both local ecosystems and local communities, and I'm really grateful to have that opportunity and be able to sort of start my career in the Arctic and hopefully continue working on this as time goes on. Northern ecosystems are at risk, but so are local communities. And ultimately, as a group, we're striving to understand what these environmental and ecological changes mean from that community standpoint. Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. I really like to make sure we save a few minutes at the end to talk about ways that all of us can help reduce plastic pollution in our own communities and environments. So I am a member of the University of Toronto trash team, and the trash team, it's our overall goal really is to increase waste literacy to fight plastic pollution. And one of my favorite quotes from the Lorax, and I'm so glad that it's on the front page of our website, is that unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And I think that's really true. And I think being able to have a bit of positivity and ways that we can all make a difference is important. So at the University of Toronto trash team, we do solutions-based research. We participate in a variety of education platforms and outreach programs, as well as community outreach, like cleanups, local cleanups, and things of this nature. And so an example of this, I mentioned earlier that laundry machines are a source of microfibers and microplastics into our systems. Our washing machines shed a lot of fibers. And so we did, a colleague of mine, Lisa Erdl, ran a study to look at the impact of washing machine filters on plastics in the wastewater treatment system. And what they found ultimately is that by installing a washing machine filter, you decrease the amount of plastic that you're shedding into the environment. And so by having that significant decrease in reduction into the wastewater treatment plant, we can then decrease the amount of plastic that is going into our local rivers, streams, and lakes. And so this is just an example of one of the solutions we can do on our own levels and within our own communities and our own lives. And other examples of things like that is just to reduce our single-use plastic, say no to straws, plastic bags, styrofoam takeout containers. We can also be involved in shoreline cleanups. And really, it's just about being a citizen scientist, educating yourself, and ultimately, if we can do these small things, not only do these small steps that we can take to help prevent plastics from getting in our own waterways, but ultimately it decreases the amount that can end up in faraway ecosystems like the Arctic. So thanks so much for your attention. and I am happy to take any questions that you may have.
Hi.
Hello.
Hold on one second. All right. So right now we have two questions. The first one is, are there books that you recommend for any high school students?
Yeah, so there's a couple of recommendations I would have. For high school high school students like later in high school, like juniors and seniors or ninth grade. I'm trying to think of whether these are, I think you could do this in high school. One of the best books, I think, regardless of what science you're interested in, is The War on Science by Sean Otto, which is something I recommend to everyone. If you're interested in science, it gives a really good overview and interesting concepts of science over time and sort of how we got here, where science is sometimes at odds with other conflicts. The other one I would recommend too is this title is not right, but there's a plastic pollution title that I'm gonna mess up. So I will send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, and if any teachers, can they not see the chat? Everyone. Okay. I'm gonna just put my email in the chat, and if any educators, students, whatnot have questions about book titles and things, just send me an email and I will get you the correct title.
All right. In order to find microplastics in fish, do you have to dispatch fish to study? Or are there concerns regarding killing off the fish species? Do you dispatch sick fish?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there's two types of, I can stop sharing my screen. There's two types of studies you can do. You can do field studies where you capture fish, bring them back and look at the plastic in their guts, which is what I do. And in order to do that, you have to go through a permitting process. There's only so many fish you can take. And from where you have to have permission from a variety of different sources. So you can't just go out and take 200 fish. It's not that simple. For the reasons of protecting fish populations. And then in terms of other fish, if you wanted to do some sort of lab experiment, you can get fish from, there's a variety of different companies actually that sell fish for toxicity studies. So you can get little small eggs of a minnow, for example. But then once you have to go through a permitting process for that as well. You have to go through ethics training. And then once the experiment is done, usually you hang on to those fish just to do some analysis on them. But sick fish are never released into the wild.
Okay. All right. The next question is, how should you properly dispose of paint since it has microplastics in it?
How can you properly dispose of, say that again? Sorry.
How properly dispose of paint?
Of paint. Oh, that's a great question. That's a very timely question, actually. So paint is a huge component of sort of anthropogenic microparticles in the environment. So for paint locally, you should always take it to, so places like Home Depot, your local landfill or transit transfer station. I'll always have like hazardous waste paint pickup days. And so if you want to get rid of paint, that's absolutely what you should do. And you should definitely not put it in the landfill or anywhere else for that matter.
Okay. Mr. K says, this is a lot of conflict that I see over water usage for cleaning and recycling plastics versus garbage. So water waste versus plastics is an environmental issue. How do you respond to this argument in order to help plastic waste?
Over water usage for cleaning. Okay, so like just to clarify, Mr. K, I'm sorry, but I think what you're saying is there's a conflict over the amount of water needed to clean plastics that are being recycled versus garbage that just goes away. Is that right? Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's it. Really what this comes down to is one, we need to reduce what we're using. And part of that is also a bit of some intense regulations that need to come in, because a lot of the things that questions we have about like plastics and how they impact environments and things are often protected by intellectual property rights. And so there needs to be transparency on the industry side. There needs to be a bit more transparency in the development of plastics. There needs to be a bit more development and money that goes into how we properly recycle plastics. There's a big hole in that process right now. And so really what it comes, I think that's a good point. And it's certainly a component of the waste infrastructure that we have now, but I think there's better ways, one, to recycle plastics and think about plastics compared to how we think about them now. And secondly, we just need to decrease our own use as well. It's a complicated question, and I'd be happy to talk about it more if you're keen.
From an anonymous attendee, I remember hearing a news story about microbeads in the Salt Lake in Utah a few years ago. Would reducing microbead use make a significant difference in the amount of microplastic pollution?
Yeah, so microbeads are now in Canada, they're banned. You can't put them in products. And they are also banned in the States, where you can't put them in products starting now. They're like phasing it out. But again, like if we can institute some of these regulations that decrease sort of production, and then ultimately our own use, that will certainly make an impact on the environment. Does that answer your question?
I hope so.
Another person asked, what's your favorite part about researching the Arctic?
Oh, that's going to the Arctic. Yeah, going to the Arctic is my favorite. I love the cold. I know that's a very unpopular opinion, but I do. I love the cold, and that is honestly probably what drew me to working in the poles generally. But the people, I'm very lucky to have amazing northern partners who've sort of welcomed me in their community, and it's very hard to describe, but the culture and the landscape and the remoteness, it's very challenging at times. Like, this is not a walk in the park, I can tell you that. It's definitely challenging, but I love the challenge, and I just love being in the north. It's sort of like my sort of that feeling of home, I guess. And I'm really lucky to be able to spend my time up there.
What are things you do to help reduce your plastic usage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I absolutely refuse to ever have plastic cutlery. I have metal forks that work just fine, and so I keep a set of cutlery in my bag anywhere I go, as well as some Tupperware containers. So usually restaurants are pretty good. Like, if you wanted to go and do takeout and just say like, I'm going to bring my own containers and have them cleaned and ready to go, they'll put them in Tupperware that you bring home or bring from home to a restaurant. We have a washing machine filter installed on our washing machine. Little things like that. And really, it's just a matter of becoming aware of how much plastic you use. So the University of Toronto, the trash team, I'm going to put I think it's .ca, in the chat. We do a waste audit exercise that people can join, and you can do it at any time. But really, it's to kind of go through on a weekly basis and see how much waste you produce. And it gives out ideas too on how we can all individually decrease the amount of waste that we have.
Okay. What is your favorite Arctic animal?
Oh, this is also probably an unpopular opinion among my colleagues because I work with fish, and I love my big fish in my Arctic jar. They're beautiful, but beluga whales, I think, will always have a special place in my heart. And narwhals. Narwhals are pretty cool. The unicorns of the sea, it's hard to argue.
All right. Somebody asked, can microplastics multiply?
Yeah. So I think what they're asking is maybe if they can fragment and one piece of plastic can break up into smaller pieces of plastic, right? And the same thing goes for microplastics. They can become smaller and smaller over time.
Okay. Is it possible for us to have microplastic in us since we do consume fish?
Yep. I'm sorry to say that. Yeah, so there's one of the big questions in plastic pollution is what this means for human health. And we don't have a really good answer. It's not my area necessarily, but yeah, I mean, we do have plastics. We've found plastics in humans and in humans in fecal samples in our poop, just like other animals, right? Which makes sense. That's how we excrete things that aren't absorbed into our bodies, and so yeah, it's certainly possible, and what that means is still yet to be decided.
Okay. All right. And then someone said, can organisms tolerate a certain amount of microplastics better than others?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I mean, a lot of this it's really cool to be a plastic scientist right now because there's our plastic pollution scientist, because there's so many questions that we don't know the answers to. Some animals do excrete plastics faster than others. So we know that plastics can be retained or stay in the gut. And we also know that they can be excreted, and sort of the time in which that happens, if it's over a day or a couple of days, kind of depends. But certainly some species are more susceptible to plastic exposure, like seabirds, for example. Because, for example, gulls outside of a big city on the East Coast is going to be able to maybe pick its way around the landfill, and then inadvertently be exposed to a lot of plastic and then take that elsewhere. And so, yeah, they definitely can change from species to species.
Are we working on a solution for weeds in wastewater treatment centers? Why isn't there an extra step in the treatment plant for that? Says Valerie.
It's a great question, Valerie. Yeah, I mean, there are solutions. So, excuse me, the filter solution for your washing machine is a way to decrease it before it gets to the wastewater treatment plant. But then you're asking about what happens, what about an extra step within the wastewater treatment plant? And I think that is certainly, it's a big question. There, to my knowledge, there isn't one that's being instituted in a big way. But that's certainly being discussed, and I'm sure people are working on that. Similar to, because plastics they're plastic particles, and wastewater treatment plants can, percolate, what we call percolation, when things settle out, sediment particles settle out to the bottom. But plastics are a little bit more complex in terms of how they react in water and move in water. Yeah, so it's an ongoing problem that's being addressed, I think, at a variety of different levels.
All right, the next question is, how long will it take to reverse this?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, These are all excellent questions, and these are all questions that we all have, right? And I don't have the answer. I think the best thing we can do now is try and reduce our own waste so that we decrease the amount that's going in right now. Plastics are tough, and they break up, right, in the environment. They're on the seabed floor, and I mean, in a very hopeful sense, it'd be great if we could just go and clean up all the plastic right from the bottom of the ocean floor, but I just don't think that's going to happen. So we need to make changes now for our own actions so that we can decrease the flow.
Jennifer wants to know if there's a way to use math to help analyze your results.
Yeah, so math is a very important part of being a scientist. So when you do organize an investigation, it takes a bit of time to, come up with your questions, organize those thoughts, and then create and plan a study. And then once you gather all your data, you have to look at trends. You have to look at whether there's differences between A and B, and being able to parse out the differences between one group of fish and another group of fish. And then also look at trends in plastic, in guts and things like that. It's all math. So math is important. And it is certainly something, no matter what you do in science, or really in life, you're always going to have to do some level of math. It's a part of everyday life. Sorry to tell you that, but it is. And so, yeah, math is a huge part of what I do. Mm-hmm.
Sam would like to know about how much plastic pollution is going into the environment each year.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's on the order of gigatons. There's an excellent paper on this, which I will try very quickly to pull up and put it in the chat. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of plastic that goes into the environment. We can move on to the next question, and then I'll put this in the chat. And then if you can't access it, it'll just be a link. If you can't access it, just send me an email and I'll send it to you.
Awesome. All right, the next question is asked by Megan. Does the temperature of the plastics impact the animal's body system?
The temperature, can you say that again?
Does the temperature of the plastic impact the animal's body system?
Oh, I don't know. The temperature of the plastic, I don't know. That's an interesting question. The temperature of the water as it warms up, as the Arctic warms up, is certainly going to impact the organism. And so, yeah, but I'm not sure about the plastic.
Susan Dalton would like to know, can microplastic cause cancer or other diseases?
I hate to say I don't know, but I think those are questions that we're still trying to understand the answers to.
Can microplastics ever disintegrate?
Not in the way that you'd think. So part of that, if we all think about the slide with the breakup, right, where we got those big pieces and they can break up into smaller pieces, that's sort of how plastics can get smaller, and I don't want to use the word break down, but break up over time. But it's very difficult to have a piece of plastic go down and disintegrate to its core components in the environment.
All right, the next question. Can microplastics bind with other microplastics and increase in size? And can they cause more damage as larger pieces or smaller pieces?
Yeah, that's a great question, and they absolutely can. We call that aggregation. So plastics can certainly, small pieces of plastic can aggregate in the environment from a variety of different physical reasons. And absolutely that can cause it can cause similar issues to what we would see with singular pieces of plastic. But yep, that can happen.
What do you think is the primary contributor to microplastics?
Yeah, so I think, well, there's a lot of sources that come to mind. And tire wear particle. So microplastics, the field of microplastics science is kind of growing into this and including things that are not plastic but are anthropogenic, so man-made, right? And this includes things like tire particles, tire wear particles. So every time we drive on the road, right, little pieces of rubber are being sort of shed off the tires as rubber hits the road. And things like microbeads, microfibers. So from our laundry, from our clothes, from the textile industry, tire particles are three of the big ones. Paint chips, which are not necessarily plastic per se, but also anthropogenic. Paint is now, there's an article in Forbes that came out today that highlights a study that over half of the microplastics that enter the ocean every year are from paint. And so these are some of the big ones, right? And these are all smaller plastics that have different sources, and parsing out those sources is difficult, right? But like I said, sort of in the middle of the talk, that there's tons of different sources. It's industry, it's residential, it's urban. Yeah, it's a complicated problem.
All right, and then John asked, are there microbeads in Africa?
Oh, probably yes. Sorry to tell you, but yeah, I'm sure there are. I've seen a couple of studies, but yeah, really what happens is, some countries have put in these regulations for banning microbeads in products and production, but that's certainly not the case everywhere, and we still have residual beads in the environment even after these regulations have put in place. So yeah, they're very prolific for sure.
Jennifer wants to know, is there a way to use how long does it take to organize and carry out an investigation?
Yeah, so it can take quite a bit of time. It can also be quite short. It just kind of depends on what you're doing. As you can imagine, the logistics of doing Arctic field work can be quite intense. And it's months planning of figuring out what coolers need to be shipped where and how to get them there, and all that good stuff. But it does take some time and effort. For big experiments, it can be months, weeks, months, years. For small experiments, if you're just maybe doing some exploratory pilot work, it can be really quick. So it just kind of depends.
All right, the next question from Susan. Will microplastics affect weather or just inside animals and in ecosystems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something that people are starting to try and understand. So plastics are part of the dust cycle, right? They're moved and transported in the atmosphere. And there's some questions and research that are trying to understand how those types of particles may impact things like refraction and reflection of UV rays, which is tangential, right? And it could potentially be related to weather, but I'm not totally up to speed on some of that work, but I do know that people are looking at it.
Can certain materials dissolve in the water and fish who breathe the water affect different systems of the fish? From Megan.
Yeah, so that's a good question, Megan. So the plastics aren't necessarily going to dissolve in water, but those plastic additives, those chemicals we talked about, those can move and leach, what we call leaching, from the particle into the water. or into the fish. So in that sense, there's some movement of contaminants, but plastics themselves won't dissolve in water.
Awesome. Well, unless anyone has any other questions, I think we have answered all of them. We do have a few more minutes, so we can wait a little bit to see if anyone else has any more questions.
Yeah, and as I said, for the educators too, if you have questions or want book recommendations and things like that, just send me an email and I'd be happy to send off some resources.
Awesome. We are not getting any in. Oh, I guess we will be getting one in. From Donna, what's your favorite penguin type?
Oh boy. It's a great question. I don't know. I like the penguin. It's the macaroni penguin with their like crazy hair. Those are fun. And penguins, yeah, I actually have a colleague that's starting on an Antarctic cruise next week to do some sampling for plastic, and she'll be able to see penguins. I'm a bit jealous.
So what is your next research project?
So I'm hoping we're gonna dive a bit into this chemical additive stuff, and whether or not these chemicals impact fish. So I'm starting some fish experiments in the lab to see how it impacts juvenile minnows, and then I'll be headed to the Arctic, hopefully early summer, depending on the COVID situation, if not in the fall. And so it'll be nice to have a change of scenery. For sure.
Well,
Let's see, Jennifer's asking what my favorite Arctic animal is that lives on land. I think I'd have to say Arctic foxes. They're very charismatic and very, very pretty and cute. We get them in field camp frequently. We also get wolves and bears, but yeah, Arctic foxes are they're pretty majestic creatures.
awesome. Well, I think that is it. Thank you so much for coming and joining us here.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Hope you're all well, stay safe, and maybe we'll see you next year.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.